Hello, and welcome to Daily Space. My name is Annie Wilson, and most weekdays, the CosmoQuest team is here putting science into your brain. Today, however, is for Rocket Roundup. Let's get to it, shall we? First up, on June 11th at 3:03 UTC, a Chinese Long March 2 Delta rocket launched 4 satellites into sun-synchronous orbit from the Haiyuan Satellite Launch Center. Before we talk about the payloads, let's watch the launch. So, the primary payload was Beijing 3, a commercial remote sensing satellite. It will be used for, quote, land and resources management, agricultural resources surveys, ecological environmental monitoring, comprehensive urban applications, and other fields, unquote. Also on board was Haisui 2, a nanosatellite developed for remote sensing of coastal regions, including shallow seas and inland water bodies. The third payload was Younghua 1, a commercial satellite which will develop technology to be used for future asteroid mining. Younghua means look up, and the satellite is a small telescope described by the manufacturer as a little Hubble, although your writing team was unable to determine the actual optical system used. The telescope is sensitive to visible and ultraviolet wavelengths. And the final satellite on board is Science Experiment 1 Tianjin. It will be used to train satellite operators and also demonstrate a new satellite health management system that is fault tolerant. Next up, on June 13th at 8:11 UTC, a Northrop Grumman Pegasus rocket launched the TAC RL-2 Odyssey satellite from the very last operational Lockheed L-1011 TriStar off the coast of Southern California. Northrop Grumman, the launch provider, said absolutely nothing about this launch until after it had already occurred. This is fairly unusual for an American launch. There was also no live webcast, and there's no video of the launch. The only public notice was the required aerospace and maritime closures that warned pilots and boat captains that a launch was about to take place. Not much was said about the spacecraft except that it had a space situational awareness mission. Built from completely off-the-shelf components, Odyssey was developed by the Space Safari Office of the Space Force in less than a year. This was the second launch in a Space Force program to develop the capability to launch months after a contract is awarded instead of the typical years. TAC RL-2 was awarded 4 months before launch, and Northrop Grumman had 21 days to put the satellite on the rocket and launch it. That's ridiculously fast for a rocket launch. The advantage of using Pegasus to launch this mission is its air launch capability. Because the rocket is carried underneath a plane, it can be launched into orbit from anywhere with a runway long enough for the plane to take off. For our last launch of the week, another classified mission. On June 15th at 1100 hours UTC, a Northrop Grumman Minotaur 1 rocket launched the NROL-111 mission from Pad 0 Bravo at the Mid-Atlantic Spaceport Complex in Virginia. The Minotaur 1 and Pegasus have a few similarities aside from both being launched by Northrop Grumman. They are both small, solid-fueled rockets, and Minotaur 1 even borrows the second and third stages from Pegasus as its third and fourth stages. The first and second stages on the Minotaur 1 are from a decommissioned Minuteman II intercontinental ballistic missile. Instead of a plane, the Minotaur 1 is launched from a typical launch pad. It makes quite the show, yeeting off the pad in a bright white-yellow streak with a liftoff thrust to weight ratio of 2.6. This is much faster than typical launch vehicles because of the power of its solid motors. Let's watch the launch.
T-minus 10. 5, mark, 4, 3, 2, 1. Marking 21 years of Minotaur launches and 15 years of partnership with NASA Wallops Flight Facility in Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport.
Vehicle supersonic.
At liftoff, the yellow thermal conditioning blanket peeled off like a banana. On the pad, it helps keep the first stages at just the right temperature, something that would have normally been done by the missile silo it was designed for. It then hung a huge left and shot towards orbit, breaking Mach 1 in 20 seconds. Like a typical National Reconnaissance Office mission, nothing was said about the payloads except that there were 3 of them. We'll be right back with This Week in Rocket History. This was a slow week for rockets, but a great week for history, and we're pleased to dedicate extra time to one of my favorite figures in spaceflight. For This Week in Rocket History, we look back at the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, and her flight aboard Vostok 6. But first, some history to put everything into context. In the early 1960s, an American physician named William Lovelace set out to demonstrate something that we now take for granted, that women are also capable of spaceflight and being astronauts, and that they might even be better suited for long missions due to their small physical size and associated lower intake of resources like food and oxygen. So, in the summer of 1961, a record-holding pilot named Jerry Cobb took and passed the same exams as the Mercury 7 male astronauts, which included eye exams, a special weighted stationary bike, a moving table that tested their circulation, among others. A private organization was unofficially testing a group of women that are now retroactively called Mercury 13 by a Hollywood producer. These women were not associated with NASA in any way and were being tested to determine suitability, not being trained to go to space. A year later, 19 more women took the same exams as the Mercury 7 astronauts. Although 13 of them qualified by the same standards set from the male astronauts, they never became astronauts, even after they went in front of Congress to make their case. Nikolai Kamanin, head of the Soviet cosmonaut training program, read news reports about Cobb and the other women that could potentially be astronauts. He decided that the USSR had to beat the Americans. The United States absolutely could not be the first country to put a woman into space. So, in early 1962, 23 final candidates for 5 female cosmonaut slots were brought to the training center for evaluation. After several months of tests, the 5 were chosen to undergo basic astronaut training, which took the rest of 1962. The final decision on who would fly was made in May 1963. Keep in mind that all of this was taking place in the backdrop of the space race and the Cold War. The USSR and the United States were competing to show the rest of the world whose economic system was better, while also building and pointing nuclear weapons at each other and waiting for the other side to blink. The criteria for a female cosmonaut was young, brave, physically strong, with aviation experience, and able to be trained for spaceflight in less than 6 months. They also had to be under the age of 30, shorter than 170 centimeters, that's just over 5.5 feet, and know how to parachute. Both male and female cosmonauts didn't need too much in the way of specialized training for the Vostok spacecraft, as the flight was largely controlled from the ground. This simplified the rush process for selecting a female cosmonaut from 400 potential candidates. From that list of 400, 5 candidates were chosen. Tatiana Ketsnova, world record holding parachutist, Valentina Ponomariova, pilot and graduate of the Moscow Institute of Aviation, Irina Solovey-Evnova, veteran of 2,000 parachute jumps, Sana Yorkina, amateur parachutist, and Valentina Tereshkova, amateur parachutist and textile worker. Valentina Tereshkova had been interested in aviation for a long time, training to be a competitive skydiver while at her job in a textile factory. Her widowed mother did not approve of this, so she had to go to the training facility in secret. She made her first jump at the age of 22 in 1959. Yuri Gagarin, who at this point had already flown into space, decided to be a mentor and guide to the new female cosmonaut candidates. The other male cosmonauts weren't too happy about them and saw their presence as taking seats away from them that were rightfully theirs. The first step in the training of the female candidates was basic flight school in both fighters and cargo planes. With this done, they were now junior lieutenants in the Soviet Air Force, a requirement to become a cosmonaut. Ketsnova and Yorkina withdrew from training later due to illness and poor performance. Valentina excelled at everything from the centrifuge to the isolation chamber to parabolic flights, in addition to the theoretical tests on spaceflight topics. She was selected in May 1963 by Kamanin to fly the Vostok 6, a joint mission with Vostok 5. Vostok 5 was to be commanded by Valery Bushovsky. Irina was to be Tereshkova's backup. Tereshkova was selected not just because of her physical and academic qualifications, but also because she had the right background that the Soviets wanted to present to the world. She grew up working on a farm, currently worked in a textile factory, and was single with a good work ethic. After the break, we'll get back to looking at Tereshkova's flight and life after returning to Earth. Stay tuned. Welcome back. So the primary goal of Vostok 6 was to investigate the effects of zero-G on the female body, as well as operations between two spacecraft in orbit. Vostok 6 launched on June 16, 1963 at 0929 UTC with Tereshkova, now the very first woman to go into space. The launch was nominal, unlike the slight third stage underperformance that left Vostok 5 in a lower than intended orbit. According to telemetry, Tereshkova's blood pressure and heart rate were lower than her comrades during his launch. On her first orbit, she came within 5 kilometers of Vostok 5 and Bushkovsky, who had launched 2 days prior, for a planned rendezvous. A proper rendezvous would have had the two spacecraft come much, much closer to each other, within tens of meters. But the Vostok spacecraft weren't able to do the kind of maneuvers needed to make that happen. Direct communication between Vostok 5 and 6 was impossible after the first day as the spacecraft drifted apart. Unlike Bushkovsky, Tereshkova had more success observing the Earth and stars through the Zor periscope and porthole. She took several video recordings of forests and streams passing below from inside the spacecraft. Tereshkova threw up after eating a particularly dry piece of bread, and that unfortunately wasn't the only problem she encountered on the flight. On her first day in orbit, she noticed a problem with the deorbit motor. If it had fired as intended, instead of coming back to Earth, she would have been sent to a higher orbit, further away from Earth, where her life support would have been depleted before the spacecraft's orbit decayed due to atmospheric drag. This, quite frankly, would have killed her. Luckily, the programming was fixed and the deorbit on the third day of the mission was nominal. She could have stayed in space longer, but she had to return because Vostok 5 had problems that caused that mission to end earlier than planned, and quite frankly, it was simpler to bring both craft back at once. Unlike Vostok 5, her service module even separated cleanly from the orbital module. The Vostoks didn't carry a big enough parachute to allow a soft landing with the cosmonaut inside, so the cosmonauts had to eject and parachute down themselves, which is why being a skydiver was a requirement for being a cosmonaut. She landed on her back, but was quickly helped up by locals. Because she landed in such a remote location, it took her 3 hours to inform ground control that she had landed safely. Vostok 6 was the very last Vostok mission. Tereshkova, she never flew again, to space or otherwise, because of her importance to the state, especially after Gagarin was killed in a training accident in 1969. She did, however, travel the world in carefully scheduled tours, with the Soviets displaying their ordinary hero to the world. After the break, we'll be back with this week's Stats and Fact. All right, to wrap things up, here's a running tally of a few spaceflight statistics for the current year. There are currently 6 toilets in space, 3 are installed on the International Space Station, 1 is on the Crew Dragon, 1 is on the Soyuz, and 1 is on the Chinese space station. There have been 54 total orbital launch attempts so far this year, including 2 failures. From those launches, humanity has put a whopping 1,152 satellites into orbit. I keep track of orbital launches by where they launched from, also known as spaceport. Here's that breakdown. USA, 24, China, 17, Kazakhstan, 4, Russia, 4, New Zealand, 3, French Guiana, 1, India, 1. And your random space fact for the week is that the first stage motor used on that NROL 111 launch this week was manufactured 54 years ago, which predates people walking on the moon. This has been the Daily Space.